I'm David Fitzgerald. I'm one of the second-year pediatric residents at UNM. Today I'm going to be giving a talk on the human papillomavirus vaccination. So some of our objectives today, we'll go through a brief review of the human papillomavirus itself and the currently available vaccines, mostly here in the US. Next, common kind of parental concerns or resistance that you can see in your practice or group from parents about getting the vaccination for their children. And then lastly, stuff we as primary care providers or clinicians can do to help improve our vaccination rates. So how many people have encountered this scenario before? So you're in your office, you're seeing an 11-year-old child for his annual routine well child check. You mentioned parents that he's due for a couple of regular vaccinations, such as his Tdap and his meningococcal, and that he's also due for the HPV vaccination. You explain this kind of briefly to parents, and then afterwards they say, one of the following, like they're okay for the Tdap and the meningococcal, but otherwise I think he's too young to have that. The HPV, they don't want him to have it yet. They don't want it because they're concerned about safety issues from a lot of stories that they've heard from their friends or on the internet that they've read. He's not sexually active just yet. This is a vaccine to prevent sexually transmitted infections. Why are we giving it to him now? We're also worried that this, again, anecdotally may increase sexual promiscuity or activity in children who are not previously active after they get the vaccine. And then lastly, he's a boy. Why does he need it if it's mostly to help prevent cervical cancer in girls? So just cutting back to kind of the basic science of the human papillomavirus. So down the right-hand corner, that's an actual picture of the virus itself. So greater than 100 different types of the subtypes of the virus that mostly affect the cutaneous or epithelial mucosal cells. Of importance to them, the ones we're worried about that cause infection and then lead to cancer, precancerous lesions. 40 different subtypes of those can infect the female genital tract. And then of most concern is HPV 16 and HPV 18, which are the most highly associated with the carcinogenic subtypes. So what kind of cancers are we worried about? Cervical being the biggest one with the HPV 16 and 18. So worldwide, pretty prevalent, high incidence, over 500,000 people each year. Most of this is in your developing countries, but still very high rates due to HPV, the 16 and the 18. And then also, even stuff that we're catching on like precancer screening or preventative screening, I should say, at least half of those cases of those precancerous lesions are still due to the 16 and 18. Other cancers associated with those types, the vulvar, vaginal, anal, and then penile cancers. These are very rare, including worldwide rates of these that include them, but in the 30 to 40 to 50,000 cases for each of those different subcategories. It's pretty not nearly as prevalent as the cervical, but again, you can see the rates depending on what you're looking at. I think the vulvar was the one that ranged a little bit in the 40 to higher, but for the vaginal, anal, and penile cancers, most of those were in like the 60 to 80% association with, again, the 16 and 18. Oropharyngeal cancer is another one that's a little bit rarer, not nearly as prevalent as the cervical again, but also you can see there 70 to 80% of those attributable to human papillomavirus in both North America and Europe. Genital warts, not a cancer, but still we can see 90% from HPV subtype 6 and 11 that lead to those. So as I talked about, cervical cancer is a much bigger issue in more developing countries, fewer vaccination resources, strategies, preventative screening, and then treatment of it. So in the US, if it's not as high of an incidence, why do we care about it, and what's the importance of the HPV vaccine? So preventative medicine is a preventable disease. Even though we have lower rates, it's still something that we can still drop the rates on in the US. So of the current available vaccinations, there's 3 of them. The Cervarix is a bivalent against the 16 and 18, which are most common types for the cervical cancer, and also is highly associated with the other ones. Gardasil, which was the original one, is a quadrivalent against 16 and 18, and then also the 6 and 11 to help prevent the genital warts. And then Gardasil 9, which is now the quadrivalent, is being phased out and replaced with the Gardasil 9. So it's a 9-valent, hence its name, that has still those 6, 11, 16, and 18 with those additional subtypes of the 31, 33, 45, 52, and 58. So who should get it and when should we be giving it to children? So all those organizations right there. So the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, the ACIP, American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Family Practitioners, ACOG, or obstetrics and gynecologists, American Cancer Association, and both the World Health Organization, all relatively about the same recommendations that, you know, both males and females between the age as young as 9 up to 12 years of age should be the initial time to give the first dose of a 2 to 3 series. Most of them recommend that 11 to 12 is the initial onset, but as early as 9 is approved to be safe for right now. So efficacy rates, so females against the this 97 to 100% efficacy for our high-grade precancerous lesions that also can lead to more severe disease. Most of that was based around cervical cancer, but still 97 to almost 100% efficacy in certain studies is pretty good results. Males, this 90% for external lesions, so again, against when immunized with the Gardasil, the quadrivalent one, against those additional 6 and 11 for genital warts. And then timing, so why are we giving it to younger kids? So most all the studies show that, again, prevention medicine, so children who are human papillomavirus naive and have never had any exposure or infections showed a much greater immune response to those who had previously had infections, whether those were treated or self-cleared immunologically. And also, even when it was studied in those like 16 to 24 who had never been exposed to the HPV vaccine, still showed much better success rates. As you can see, they're dropped off significantly, you know, almost half down to 40 to 60% efficacy rates. And even just older children, 16 to 24, who still have never been exposed to the HPV or to the virus itself. So data lacking in again, most of the data concerned around cervical cancer prevention. But as we talked about, even though they're rare, those other subtypes, the anal and oropharyngeal data is lacking in those. But we can possibly infer that still, since those have a high association of HPV 16 and 18, which our vaccines are hoping to immunize against, that we could likely see a decrease in those. But again, the data is lacking. We need more evidence for that. This extra bit of information is placebo-controlled trial of around 4,000 males. This is an initial study just of the efficacy of the HPV against viral infection in males, but a planned sub-study of that population, about 600 males who also have sex with other males, showed about a 78% efficacy for preventing anal intraepithelial neoplasias. So still pretty promising results. 600 is not a lot when we look at, you know, numbers of trials and stuff. 600 just a small set, but still pretty promising data. Again, just need more studies and more data to come on those that hopefully show that the continued use of those also prevents those other types of cancers. So what can we, common issues or setbacks that we are concerns that we get from parents. So as you can see in this cartoon, this girl says, "Mom, Dad, I'm pregnant," and they say, "Oh, thank God, we just thought you were overweight, obese." So just reinforcing that a lot of times us as providers, what we're thinking about are not always going to be the same types of concerns that the parents are going to be bringing up. So a lot of the common things, the most common kind of complaints or concerns about stuff. Again, just like I mentioned, that sample case, that they're too young to receive the vaccine, that we're giving it to them when they're not sexually active at all. Why do they need it? They're worried that it's going to, you know, by giving this vaccination to help prevent sexually transmitted infections, we're reinforcing to the children that they're going to be immune to it and it's okay, they can do whatever they want. Information regarding that. Again, we're mostly trying to prevent cervical cancer, so why are we vaccinating males for it as well? Safety, I think, is a valid, you know, all of these, I should say, are valid concerns from parents, but the safety, what diseases are caused by HPV, and really a risk for cancer in the United States, I think those are all a little higher, at least for me, valid concerns from parents, and shows me that they're wanting to be involved in their child's healthcare, a little more educated on it at least. And then anecdotal stories, again, about safety and infertility, some stuff going around about premature ovarian failure. So again, as we talked about, the kids are too young for it. Prevention is the key word here. Is that, as we talked about already, those that were younger, regardless of whether they were HPV naive or not, the 11 to 12 showed a much better immunological response than those older children. And also, too, again, just with them not being exposed to the virus initially, they're going to show a better response than to those that were studied that had already shown previous HPV infections, whether they were cleared or not, still mounted a lower immune response. Just as a side note too, even if children are older and they're in the catch-up phase, or if they have had previous known HPV infections that have ever been treated, or you're testing or like seropositive or DNA tests, that is not a contraindication. Although we're having, our probably efficacy is still a little bit lower, we should still be encouraged to vaccinate those children, and it's not a contraindication that it's not going to work for them. It just may be a little bit less, but still important to continue with vaccinations in them. Reassuring parents that, even though it's to sexually inactive children, or if that's what they think, or, if they're, whatever their beliefs are, if they feel that their children need to wait till much later on in life to engage in sexual activity, no data support any increased sexual activity or interest in those previously who were not after receiving the vaccination. Next, that it's for females only, that we're trying to prevent the cervical cancers. So again, even though we talked about those other categories, the penile cancer, anal cancer, or pharyngeal, even though those are much lower incidence, they're still at risk for the HPV from the 16-18 associations. So giving males, they can still get those, carry those infections, so be at risk for developing those cancers, so we still want to prevent them. And then also the idea of herd immunity. A lot of studies have looked at cost effectiveness of vaccinating both females and males as opposed to just females. A lot of the data suggests that if we have great, fantastic rates of immunizations in females, that the males would be less likely needed, but currently we don't really have that in a lot of places. So when we're doing both vaccinations for the males and the females can be carriers of it, even if they're not at risk obviously for the cervical cancer. We're preventing those other ones, and then the more males that are immunized and don't have active transmission or HPV infections, less of a risk of them transmitting to other females. No data suggests any link to any infertility or premature ovarian failure at this point. And then I think overall, just which we probably encounter a lot with other vaccinations in general, with a subset population of most of our parents, concerned about the overall safety of the vaccination, the HPV being a little bit newer one, so I think parents are sometimes a little more hesitant to that one as opposed to our other vaccinations for communicable disease have been around for decades now. But reassuring that, again, just going through like the rigorous testing and studies of all vaccinations in order to even be considered for FDA approval, even to get to that point. It's been studied in thousands and thousands and thousands of individuals before even getting to the market to give to children. No evidence to date so far of any severe associated complications. And then I think also just reassuring parents that it's not just in the US, that this is worldwide. Again, we talked about the World Health Organization recommendations of stuff, but many, many countries involved in all of this compiled data, lots of different governments, if those are parents' concerns sometimes, but lots and lots of different countries contributing to these data that it is a safe vaccination. Just in the US alone, again, to emphasize the risk of adverse events. So the VAERS is the Vaccination Adverse Event Reporting system. It's just the United States system for not just the HPV, but all vaccinations that we give. Any problems that occur, any adverse events to be reported to them. So between June 2006 and March 2013, 57 million doses of the HPV vaccine were distributed. And between those years, only 22,000 reports of any type of adverse event to the agency. So even if you just don't even pay attention to whether that was mild or a moderate or severe type of event, 22,000 divided into 57 million gives you a 0.04% chance of any event happening. Of those 22,000, when they were looked at and studied, 92% of them deemed mild, so this includes your irritation at the injection site, pain, swelling, bruising. So when you further decrease that number, that leaves about 2,000 moderate to severe issues, and that further decreases chances down to a 0.004% chance. Most of those in the moderate to severe category, so some reported issues of death post-vaccination, but most of those, vast majority of the issues were venous thrombotic events or syncopal episodes. But of any of those case reports, especially with like the VTEs, most of those people already had predisposing factors, or and then with the other things such as syncopal episodes, and even the cases of death, there's still, after studied and evaluated, no link or associated that for sure the HPV vaccine caused that, or can be an explanation for it. So strategies for the primary care provider. So I don't know if you can see the number one, the big red box is kind of the most important part of that picture. Although again, we talked about, cervical cancer as being, and a lot of those other cancers being a worldwide problem or a lower incidence and not as common. That was one of the main concerns of parents is do we really need to be concerned about any cancers associated with HPV? So I think that little diagram, that red box, that clock puts it in a pretty good perspective. So in the United States, about 27,000 people each year diagnosed with a type of cancer that can be attributed to HPV. Again, 27,000 compared to the population of the United States, not a huge number, but when you kind of calculate it out, it equates to one person every 20 minutes of every single day for every year long. That seems like a pretty significant amount of people that hopefully preventable disease that we could be reducing those rates. Another one of the tips on so both AAP, if you have access to it, and the CDC, which everyone should have access to, hopefully, they have lots of tips and toolboxes and advice for the primary care provider on what we can do to help reassure parents or explain to them their concerns. I think one of the good examples that they had given was not to necessarily single it out as, your child's due for Tdap and meningococcal, and we can also give the HPV vaccine today if you want, but just, mentioning not necessarily to hide it or like sneak it in there thing, but just going along, commonalizing things and saying, they're due for these 3 vaccines today. The Tdap prevents against pertussis, meningococcal can prevents against CNS infections, and then the HPV can prevent against cancers. And not trying to kind of single it out and make a big point of it that it's sexually transmitted infections or diseases. Also, they have lots of tips on, kind of the next more important part is that it's a 2 and 3 dose series. So again, after just one dose, well, it's better than nothing. The efficacy rates are not as good as getting the second and hopefully the 3rd doses. So ensuring as your group, your practice, your clinic, whatever, that you're getting those children back to ensure that they're in the allotted time to come back and get their next doses. Again, the CDC has lots of tips and visual aid handouts for parents and for your office, in order to educate the rest of your staff, your other co-workers on tips that you guys can be successful. And then just kind of lastly, here's, this is data from 2014, one of the most recent ones I could find on the CDC. So this shows the overall vaccination rates in the United States. So about a 40% compliance rate right now. As you can see, us in New Mexico, at least up on kind of the middle area in the 40 to 45-ish%. There's still room for improvement, and in the United States in general. And this statement, experts estimate that if we could improve rates to 80% in just females alone, that would prevent an additional 53,000 cases of cervical cancer over the lifetime of those individuals older than 12. So I think, again, just stressing the point of preventable medicine, we can, if it's not huge rates, we can still decrease a lot of cases. So here are some of my references. And then lastly, there's my contact information and any questions at this point.